The trail had thinned into something more like a memory of a path than a real one, the kind that only occasional footsteps kept alive. Vines had begun to reclaim the ground, and tall grass leaned inward as if trying to close the space behind him. He walked slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet, his breath steady, his eyes moving in small, practiced arcs. It was there, in a shallow pocket of flattened green, that he noticed the shapes. Two small forms lay pressed against the earth, half hidden by stalks bending over them. At first he thought they were shadows or fallen branches tangled together. Then one of them shifted, barely, and the movement was so slight it almost disappeared into the wind. He stopped completely. Curiosity softened into something heavier, something that settled in his chest and stayed. He crouched several meters away, lowering himself with deliberate care, as though the ground itself might crack under sudden movement. Through the grass, he could see their striped coats dulled by dust, their ribs faintly visible beneath skin that seemed too loose for such young bodies. Their breaths came unevenly, shallow pulls followed by long pauses that felt too long. One cub lifted its head an inch before letting it fall again, the motion weak and unfinished. The other pressed closer, its body trembling in small, irregular waves. Insects hovered lazily around them, indifferent to their struggle. Somewhere farther off, a bird called once and then went quiet. He felt the space around them shrink, as if the entire clearing had narrowed to this fragile pair and the thin thread of air moving in and out of their lungs. He placed his backpack down slowly and knelt, keeping his hands visible, his posture low and unthreatening. Years of reading about wildlife encounters had taught him restraint, but knowledge felt thin in the presence of something so immediate. He whispered without realizing it, his voice barely stronger than breath. "It's okay, easy now." The words were not meant to command or comfort in any human sense. They were simply an offering of calm. One cub opened its eyes halfway, dark and unfocused, blinking against the light. Its ears twitched weakly. When he shifted his weight, both cubs flinched, their bodies tightening for a moment before exhaustion reclaimed them. He froze again, letting the tension dissolve on its own. Another quiet murmur escaped him. "I'm here." Time slowed into something almost liquid. He remained there, unmoving, watching for signs that they were slipping further away. The grass brushed lightly against their fur, moved by a passing breeze that carried the faint scent of dry soil and old leaves. Somewhere beyond the plantation's crumbling edges, life continued in steady rhythms, unaware of this small, precarious moment. One cub stretched a paw weakly, touching its sibling's flank before letting it rest there. Their breaths, though fragile, remained. The sky above filtered pale light through broken branches, and it settled softly over the clearing, holding the scene in a quiet, trembling balance. The journey away from the tall grass unfolded in careful increments, marked by pauses, soft adjustments, and constant awareness of how fragile the small bodies were. Wrapped loosely in a clean cloth, the cubs were carried in a way that kept them close to warmth without pressing too tightly against their ribs. Each step was measured. At the shelter, a modest structure tucked between trees and open ground, the air held a different stillness, one shaped by quiet routines and practiced restraint. Inside, light filtered through narrow windows and fell across wooden tables and woven mats. The cubs were placed gently onto a padded surface, their movements slow and hesitant, their muscles barely responding. One emitted a faint, breathy sound that barely registered as a call. A caretaker leaned in and whispered almost unconsciously, "Easy, you're safe." No hands lingered longer than necessary. Everything was done in short, respectful motions, as if rushing might fracture something invisible. Water was offered first, measured in drops and guided with patience. Their tongues moved weakly, uncertain of the sensation, pausing often as fatigue overwhelmed instinct. The caretakers watched closely, adjusting angles, waiting between each attempt. Hunger revealed itself in small ways, a trembling jaw, a hesitant nudge toward the feeding cloth, a brief surge of energy that faded as quickly as it came. Food followed slowly, never forced, never rushed. One cub turned its head away after only a few mouthfuls, its body curling inward. The other persisted longer, driven by something stubborn and quiet. Outside, wind shifted dry leaves along the ground, and the shelter seemed to breathe with it, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the fragile lives inside. Days passed in subtle transformations. The cubs began to lift their heads more often, holding them upright for longer moments before resting again. Their eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, grew more alert, tracking movement in small, careful arcs. Feeding became a ritual, repeated at the same hours under the same gentle light. No loud voices entered the room. No sudden gestures interrupted their fragile progress. Human presence was kept consistent but distant, always visible, never intrusive. One caretaker, while adjusting a blanket, murmured softly, "You're doing well," before stepping back again. The cubs responded not with recognition, but with steadier breathing, with bodies that no longer tensed at every shift of shadow. Trust emerged not as a moment, but as a gradual loosening. A tail no longer tucked so tightly. A paw resting openly instead of curled beneath the chest. They began to lean subtly toward warmth rather than away from it, choosing proximity without being summoned. When strength returned in small increments, it revealed itself in brief attempts to stand, in wobbly steps that ended in gentle collapses onto padded ground. No one hurried them. No one celebrated loudly. Progress was acknowledged in silence, in careful notes, in hands folded patiently at a distance. And in the quiet space between feedings and rest, as afternoon light slid slowly across the shelter floor, the cubs lay side by side, breathing more evenly now, their striped bodies rising and falling together like a fragile promise learning how to keep itself. Time reshaped the shelter in ways that were easy to miss if no one was paying attention. The narrow windows once filled with soft, pale light now framed taller shadows cast by growing bodies. Where two fragile forms had once lain motionless, there were now stretches of muscle and patterned fur that shifted with quiet confidence. The cubs' breathing had deepened, their movements sharpened, their reactions quicker and more deliberate. They no longer trembled at unfamiliar sounds. Instead, their ears rotated toward distant calls, toward rustling leaves, toward signals carried on the wind. Their world was expanding even within the boundaries meant to protect them. The caretakers adjusted with equal care. Contact was reduced gradually, never abruptly. Feedings became more distant, placed and left rather than offered by hand. Voices softened further, then faded almost entirely. The routine remained, but its shape changed. Observation replaced interaction. Presence became something quiet and peripheral. From behind screened barriers or shaded corners, they watched the young tigers test their strength. One would spring clumsily toward a hanging rope, miss, regroup, and try again with sharper precision. The other learned to stalk shadows cast by branches, lowering its body, pausing, calculating distance before pouncing. Dust rose in small clouds beneath their paws and settled slowly back onto the ground, marking invisible hours. Instinct began to surface in subtle ways. They paced along the edges of their enclosure, noses lifted, tasting scents that drifted in from beyond the fence. Their vocalizations deepened, no longer the soft, breathy sounds of infancy, but low, uncertain murmurs that resonated through their chests. They spent longer stretches apart, resting under separate patches of shade, meeting again only when hunger or curiosity drew them together. When storms passed overhead, they no longer sought shelter near human-made structures. Instead, they chose dense foliage, pressing into natural cover, learning where safety could be found without guidance. The caretaker watched all of this from a distance that grew more intentional with each passing week. He stood behind trees, behind mesh, behind necessity. His movements slowed even further, careful not to attract attention. Once, while adjusting equipment near the enclosure, he whispered almost without sound, "You're ready." No response came, nor was one expected. One tiger glanced briefly in his direction before turning away, attention captured by something unseen beyond the boundary. That small, unremarkable moment carried more weight than any display of affection ever could. Letting go unfolded not as a single decision, but as a long series of quiet withdrawals. Fewer visits, longer absences, trust placed in instincts rather than in hands. The young tigers grew leaner, stronger, their coats gleaming under open light. They moved now with purpose, with an awareness shaped by months of careful distance. And in the evenings, when the sun lowered behind distant hills and painted the enclosure in soft gold, the caretaker would pause at the far edge of the grounds, watching two powerful silhouettes move through tall grass, their forms blending slowly into shadow, carrying forward a life that no longer needed him. 2 years passed without announcement, without ceremony. The shelter remained, weathered by seasons and softened by creeping vines, its routines quieter now, shaped by new arrivals and gentle departures. The forest beyond its boundaries had thickened, branches weaving tighter canopies, roots pushing deeper into dark soil. Rangers and caretakers continued their work with the same measured rhythm, moving along familiar paths, scanning the ground for signs that told stories without words. It was along the old forest edge, where grass met shadow and earth stayed damp long after rain, that the first marks appeared. Wide impressions pressed into soft mud. Deep, deliberate. Too large to belong to anything small. Too defined to be ignored. They were noticed at first without excitement, logged quietly, measured, photographed, and left undisturbed. Over the following weeks, more appeared. Along streambeds, near fallen logs, beside narrow animal trails that twisted between trees. Each print held the weight of something strong, something moving with confidence and intention. Claw marks faintly traced the edges. The stride length spoke of maturity. No fences were breached. No structures were disturbed. Whatever passed through did so with awareness, with restraint. It moved like something that understood boundaries without needing to test them. Evenings grew longer as the season shifted. Light lingered in amber layers, sliding slowly across leaves and bark. One such evening, as cicadas began their steady chorus and air cooled just enough to settle dust, a caretaker paused near the clearing that once served as a transition space for release. He stood still, listening. A branch cracked softly somewhere within the trees. Then another. Not hurried. Not careless. Just present. He lowered himself onto a fallen log and waited without expectation. From between two dense trunks, a shape emerged. At first, it was only shadow separating itself from darker shadow. Then stripes became visible, pale against deepening dusk. A large tiger stepped forward, placing each paw with deliberate care, muscles shifting smoothly beneath its coat. It paused at the edge of open ground, head lifted, nostrils flaring slightly as it sampled the air. Its eyes reflected faint light, steady and alert. Moments later, a second form followed, slightly smaller, moving with the same quiet authority. They stood together, bodies angled toward the clearing, tails resting low and relaxed. Neither approached. Neither retreated. They remained where forest met open space, balance between concealment and visibility. The caretaker did not move. His breath slowed until it matched the rhythm of the evening. After a long moment, he whispered, barely audible even to himself, "Good, good." The sound dissolved into the surrounding hush. One tiger turned its head slightly in his direction, ears rotating, eyes narrowing just enough to acknowledge presence without invitation. Then it looked away, attention shifting back to the forest beyond. They lingered only briefly. A few minutes, perhaps less. Enough to be seen. Enough to be known. Then, as light faded and insects grew louder, the larger tiger stepped back first, disappearing into shadow. The second followed, stripes dissolving into branches and leaves until nothing remained but moving air. The clearing returned to stillness. Above, the sky deepened into soft indigo, and wind moved gently through tall grass, carrying with it the quiet certainty that some bonds do not ask to be held, only remembered. The space they left behind did not close immediately. It remained open for a while, held by cooling air and drifting dust, as if the forest itself were considering what had just passed through. The caretaker stayed seated on the fallen log, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes fixed on the place where stripes had dissolved into shadow. His body did not lean forward. His feet did not shift. He allowed the moment to settle without disturbing it, the way one might allow ripples on water to fade on their own. Around him, the evening continued its slow rearrangement. Crickets layered their calls into steady patterns. Leaves brushed against one another in soft, repetitive whispers. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a bird released a final, tired note before falling silent. The clearing no longer held visible movement, yet it still carried the presence of what had been there. Paw prints pressed faintly into loose soil. Bent grass leaned at new angles. The air retained traces of warm fur and forest musk, already thinning with each passing breath. He exhaled quietly, a sound barely stronger than wind moving through reeds. Without raising his voice, without directing it anywhere in particular, he murmured, "Be well." The words were not meant to reach them. They were simply released like something carried downstream. His shoulders lowered slightly, tension slipping away in small degrees. There was no urge to stand. No instinct to follow. He understood, with a clarity shaped by years of restraint, that distance was not absence. It was respect. In his memory, fragile bodies wrapped in cloth still existed. Uneven breaths. Weak paws trembling against woven mats. Eyes once clouded with exhaustion. Those images no longer caused pain. They had softened into something quieter, something rooted in gratitude rather than longing. What stood before him now, what had stood briefly in the fading light, was not an extension of that past. It was its fulfillment. Strength grown without interference. Instinct sharpened without dependency. Lives shaped beyond his reach. The forest accepted their return without ceremony. No branches snapped in farewell. No echoes followed their retreat. They vanished as naturally as they had appeared, absorbed into layered greens and deepening blues. The caretaker remained still until the last suggestion of movement was gone, until even imagination could no longer trace their path. Only then did he rise, joints stiff, movements unhurried. He walked back along the narrow trail, boots pressing softly into damp soil. Behind him, the clearing slowly rearranged itself. Grass lifted. Dust settled. Shadows shifted with the lowering sun. By the time he reached the shelter's edge, the sky had softened into wide bands of orange and violet. Light slipped between branches and stretched across the ground in long, quiet lines. He paused once more and looked back. Nothing moved where they had stood. Only tall grass swaying gently in the evening breeze, catching the last warmth of day, whispering against itself as darkness settled in, holding in its rhythm the memory of two silhouettes returning to where they belonged.